In this episode, we're going to take a step that many beginners skip, not because it is hard, but because it feels less exciting than building and deploying new systems. The step is validation, meaning you confirm that compute is still secure after it has been deployed, after it has changed, and after your environment has grown. A cloud workload can start out clean and well-designed, and then quietly drift into risk as updates happen, teams move fast, and exceptions pile up. Attackers do not need you to make a dramatic mistake. They only need one small opening that stays open long enough to matter. Validation keeps you honest by turning security from a one-time build activity into a continuous check that your environment still matches what you intended. By the end, you should understand what baselines are, how policy enforcement works at a high level, and why continuous posture checks are one of the most practical ways to keep compute from slowly becoming unsafe. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A baseline is your definition of normal and acceptable for a system, written down in a way that can be checked, repeated, and compared over time. For compute, baselines usually include things like which operating system settings should be enabled, which services should be running, which ports should be exposed, and which security controls should be turned on by default. The reason baselines matter is that without them, you cannot confidently say whether a system is secure because you have nothing to measure against. Beginners sometimes treat security as a feeling, like the system seems fine because nothing bad has happened yet. But security operations need something more reliable than vibes. A baseline gives you a clear target state, which makes it possible to detect drift, spot risky deviations, and make consistent decisions across hundreds or thousands of instances. Once you have a baseline, validation becomes a routine comparison rather than a debate every time someone asks if a server is configured correctly. It also helps to understand that baselines are not meant to be perfect or universal, because different workloads have different needs and risks. A web server baseline will not look exactly like a database baseline, and a development environment baseline may allow slightly more flexibility than a production baseline. The beginner trap is to make a baseline so strict that it blocks real work, which leads people to bypass it, or to make it so vague that it cannot be enforced. A good baseline is specific enough to be testable and flexible enough to support the intended purpose of the workload. It should focus on decisions that actually reduce risk, such as limiting unnecessary network exposure and ensuring logging is present, rather than chasing cosmetic preferences. When baselines are practical, teams are more likely to adopt them, and when teams adopt them, validation becomes a normal part of how systems are operated rather than an occasional emergency reaction. Baselines become even more valuable in cloud compute because cloud environments change constantly, sometimes without humans noticing. Autoscaling can create new instances, deployments can replace old ones, and platform updates can alter defaults under the hood. That speed and dynamism are great for reliability and agility, but they create a security challenge. You can lose track of what is running and what settings are actually in effect. Validation answers the question of whether the system you think you have is the system you really have. If you harden an image but then someone launches an instance from an older image, validation should catch the mismatch. If an emergency change opens a port temporarily and the port never gets closed, validation should flag the drift. In a cloud world where changes can be frequent and distributed across teams, baselines act like a shared contract that keeps compute security from becoming a collection of inconsistent personal habits. Policy enforcement is the next piece, because a baseline that exists only as a document is easy to ignore. A policy, in this context, is a rule that expresses what is allowed and what is not allowed, tied to real technical conditions that can be checked. Enforcement means the environment can detect when reality violates the rule and respond in a predictable way, such as blocking a risky change, alerting the right people, or marking the resource as non-compliant. Beginners sometimes think enforcement is the same as punishment, but in well-run environments, it is closer to guardrails on a mountain road. The guardrail does not exist because you expect everyone to drive badly. It exists because mistakes happen, and the consequence of one mistake can be severe. When policy enforcement is aligned with baselines, it ensures that secure defaults remain secure over time, even when people are busy, stressed, or moving quickly. That is how you keep compute security consistent without relying on everyone remembering every rule perfectly. A common misunderstanding is believing that enforcement must always mean blocking, as if every violation should immediately stop the world. Blocking has its place, especially for high-risk changes. But enforcement can also mean guided correction, structured approval, or time-limited exceptions that are visible and reviewable. If a workload must temporarily run an additional service for a legitimate reason, enforcement can require that the exception be documented and that it expires automatically. If a new instance is launched outside the baseline, enforcement might allow it to run but flag it for rapid remediation, so it does not quietly become permanent. The key idea is that enforcement makes deviations visible and manageable, rather than invisible and forgotten. Attackers benefit when misconfigurations are quiet and long-lived. So enforcement is one of the best ways to reduce the time that risky conditions exist. In practice, even a simple enforcement model that consistently identifies non-compliant compute is a huge improvement over a world where no one notices drift until after an incident. Continuous posture checks are the daily heartbeat that makes baselines and enforcement meaningful in real operations. A posture check is a recurring evaluation of whether a resource matches expected security conditions, and continuous means it happens repeatedly, not just during audits. The phrase Cloud Security Posture Management, CSPM, is often used to describe this idea across cloud resources, but the core concept is simpler than the name suggests. You are regularly asking, are the settings still correct? Are the exposures still controlled? And are the permissions still appropriate for what this system is supposed to do? Posture checks matter because cloud risk is not static, and a system that was compliant yesterday might be non-compliant today due to a change, a patch, or a newly discovered weakness. Beginners sometimes treat compliance checks as a paperwork event that happens once a year, but continuous posture checks make compliance and security feel like a living state of health. When posture is monitored continuously, you can catch problems early, when fixes are small and disruption is low. Validation works best when it is layered, because compute security has multiple dimensions that support each other. One dimension is configuration, which includes operating system settings, enabled services, and network exposure. Another dimension is identity and access, which includes how the workload authenticates to other services and what permissions it holds through IAM. Another dimension is software hygiene, such as whether the workload is running patch components and whether it matches the approved image version. A posture check that looks at only one dimension may miss important risk because attackers often exploit combinations, like a slightly overpermissive role paired with a reachable management interface. When you validate across layers, you are more likely to catch the subtle conditions that make compromise possible. This layered view also helps investigations, because when an alert appears, you can quickly see whether the compute was already drifting away from baseline, which often explains why an attacker succeeded. Baselines also help you define what normal network behavior should look like for a workload, and that makes abnormal movement easier to detect. If your baseline says a workload should not initiate outbound internet connections, then any outbound connection becomes a high-signal event, not just another piece of noise. If the baseline says a workload should communicate only with a specific internal service, then new internal flow patterns stand out as potential lateral movement. This is where validation supports detection in a very practical way, because it simplifies what you need to watch for. Instead of trying to detect every possible attacker technique, you enforce a smaller set of allowed behaviors, and then alert when behavior falls outside that set. Beginners sometimes worry that they cannot predict attacker behavior well enough to defend against it, but baselines let you defend by controlling your own behavior. When your environment is predictable, attacker movement becomes less able to blend in. A major benefit of continuous posture checks is how they reduce the hidden lifespan of misconfigurations that would otherwise sit quietly for months. Misconfigurations often happen through normal human activity, like someone opening access for troubleshooting and forgetting to revert it, or someone copying a permissive setting from a test environment into production. The cloud makes these mistakes easier because changes are quick and the impact can spread widely. Continuous checks catch these conditions soon after they appear, which reduces the window attackers have to find and exploit them. This is similar to the idea of shrinking persistence windows with immutable infrastructure, except now the focus is on shrinking misconfiguration windows. The sooner you detect drift, the easier it is to fix, and the less likely it becomes that the drift turns into an incident. Over time, this constant correction loop keeps the environment closer to its intended secure state. Policy enforcement also interacts with change processes, even when you are not thinking in formal enterprise terms. Many cloud environments use a release pipeline, and the phrase continuous integration and continuous deployment, CI/CD, is often used to describe automated build and release flows. The important security idea is that changes should be predictable, reviewable, and repeatable, because that reduces the chance of accidental risk. When policy enforcement is part of the change flow, risky changes are caught closer to the moment they are introduced, which prevents surprises later. This does not require you to become an expert in deployment systems, because the beginner concept is simply that security checks should happen as part of how you change systems, not as an afterthought. If changes can happen without any validation, drift becomes the default state. When validation is tied to changes, drift becomes an exception that is visible and correctable. Another beginner misunderstanding is thinking that posture checks are only about finding problems, when they are also about proving what is going well. When a system remains compliant over time, that is evidence that your hardening, service reduction, and patch cadence are actually working. That evidence matters for operational confidence, because it reduces the amount of uncertainty you carry into every incident and every audit conversation. It also helps teams prioritize, because you can focus remediation on the few systems that are truly drifting rather than treating everything as unknown. In a healthy program, posture findings drive action, and action drives improvement, which then shows up as fewer findings over time. This feedback loop makes security feel less like random firefighting and more like a managed process. For beginners, it is helpful to see validation as a way to reduce stress, because it replaces panic with visibility. It is also important to talk about exceptions, because every real environment has them, and unmanaged exceptions are one of the fastest ways to lose control of compute security. An exception is a decision to allow a system to deviate from baseline for a specific reason, for a specific period, with a specific owner. Without those boundaries, exceptions become permanent loopholes that attackers can eventually exploit. Continuous posture checks make exceptions visible, which is good, but you also need a mindset that treats exceptions as temporary debt, not as a new normal. If a workload truly needs a different configuration, the better long-term solution is often to create a separate baseline for that workload class rather than leaving a one-off drift forever. That keeps your environment understandable, because the rules remain consistent and intentional. When exceptions are handled with discipline, validation remains credible, and teams do not start treating compliance as optional. When you connect all of this back to investigating alerts, validation becomes a crucial source of context that improves decision-making. If an alert suggests unusual outbound traffic, a posture view can tell you whether that workload was supposed to have outbound access at all. If an alert suggests lateral movement, posture data can show whether segmentation rules or permissions were recently modified. If an alert suggests privilege abuse, posture checks can reveal whether the identity associated with the workload had a role that was broader than intended. This is how baselines and continuous checks turn into practical investigative accelerators, because they reduce the time spent asking basic questions about what should have been true. Attack investigations often stall when defenders cannot tell what normal is, and baselines solve that problem by defining normal in advance. In other words, validation is not only preventative, it is also the groundwork that makes detection and response faster and more accurate. To close, validating compute security is how you make secure deployment durable rather than temporary, because it ensures that what you intended remains true after changes, scaling, and daily operational pressure. Baselines define what acceptable looks like in concrete, checkable terms. Policy enforcement keeps those expectations from being ignored, and continuous posture checks catch drift before it becomes an attacker's opportunity. This approach reduces attack surface by keeping unnecessary exposure from creeping in, and it increases detection quality by making abnormal behavior easier to spot against a clear expected state. It also makes investigations stronger because you can use posture and baseline evidence to decide whether an alert represents benign variability or a real compromise pattern. For brand new learners, the most important lesson is that cloud security is not a one-time build activity, and it is not only about responding to incidents after the fact. When you validate continuously, you keep compute aligned with secure intent, and that alignment is one of the most reliable ways to stay ahead of both mistakes and attackers.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.